Welcome to Wallsend, a historic town to the east of central Newcastle upon Tyne that, as the name suggests, is located roughly at the end of the historic Hadrian's Wall, built by the Romans 1900 years ago. Owing to that rather important part of local heritage, you'll find references to the Romans all over Wallsend, such as this striking new sculpture of a Roman Centurion, which is popularly seen as the ending point for those walking the length of Hadrian's Wall all the way from Cumbria on the other side of England. In reality, the end of the 73-mile Roman wall is actually a few hundred yards away on the banks of the mighty River Tyne, but the historic fortification against unconquered lands to the north effectively came to an end right here at the fort known as Segedunum. And here beside this car park on the edge of central Wallsend, we can see the millennia-old remains of Segedunum itself. The fort, whose name is thought to simply mean Strong Fort or Victory Fort, was built sometime around the year 122 AD, when construction on Hadrian's Wall began. For about 300 years from then, Segedunum was used as a large garrison that at its height housed 600 Roman soldiers, standing as a symbol of the Roman strength in the face of so-called barbarians to the north of the wall. Of course, Segedunum was abandoned around the turn of the 5th century AD as the Romans began their withdrawal from Britannia, and it fell into decay over the following centuries. Today, the local area is rather different, with this space-age visitor centre and viewing platform located beside the fort's remains. But interestingly, after Segedunum was abandoned by the Romans, it remained open land for well over 1,000 years. And it wasn't until 1884, and the rise of local coal mining, that a large Victorian terraced housing estate was built right on top of the Roman fort. The houses were demolished in the 1970s, and today the sprawling remains of Segedunum remain on display for all to see, as one of the most thoroughly excavated forts along all of Hadrian's Wall. The legacy of Hadrian's Wall is without doubt the most famous piece of local heritage in Wallsend. So much so that it gives its name to the town. But where exactly is Wallsend in the wider scope of the region? Well, as you can see from this map, Wallsend lies just a few miles to the east of the big city of Newcastle upon Tyne, and equally just a few miles from England's eastern coast and the North Sea. Nearly 2,000 years ago, this area of Wallsend was heavily guarded by the Roman garrison at Segedunum. But this neighbourhood would later become a hub of shipbuilding, with this ornate clock of the late Victorian era built outside the historic Swan Hunter's Shipyard, one of Tyneside's most enduring shipbuilders. Swan Hunter ended their building of ships on the Tyne in 2006, and the site of their shipyard is today a large business park, and, in a completely different realm of local heritage, the Geordie Shore House used in the reality TV show. But just a few steps away from the Geordie Shore House is the River Tyne, and the point where Hadrian's Wall reached its end. But given that the Romans aimed to use the wall to defend against the Celts to the north, why wasn't it extended all the way to the coast? 73 miles away over on the other side of the country in what is today Cumbria, Hadrian's Wall comes to an end in the town of Bowness-on-Solway, on the shores of the Solway Firth that flows out into the Irish Sea. Now initially, the wall's eastern end was at the fort of Pons Aelius in modern-day Newcastle, but the Romans extended the wall in 127 AD a few miles to Wallsend here. The wall was then ended here because the River Tyne, which flows another 4 miles out to sea, is wide enough to have been difficult to traverse by any would-be attackers from the north. And either way, the Romans maintained a significant military presence on the south side of the river, closer to the coast, with a huge fort at Arbea, today the town of South Shields. The fort then remained a significant site of the furthest reaches of the Romans' continental empire for centuries, but as we know, Segedunum was eventually abandoned. But as well as the remains of the fort itself, you'll find countless references to Roman heritage all over Wallsend, even in places like the town's metro station here. 6 stops along from Newcastle Central Station on the city's bustling light rail network, Wallsend Station is the gateway to the town for many, and it gives a flavour of the local Roman heritage to visitors the moment they step off the train. As you can see from these images, a number of the signs in Wallsend are displayed in both English and Latin, a lovely little Easter egg to greet visitors to the town. But once you've disembarked at Segedunum on Segestus Unus and walked down to hop on a bus at the Raidarum Publicarum Statio, you'll discover that there's even more to Wallsend than its illustrious Roman heritage and association with the legendary Hadrian's Wall. We'll talk more about Hadrian's Wall as we continue our walk, but as we now make our way up Station Road, we'll take a deep dive into the history of this town as we pass by its many impressive landmarks, from historic pubs to grand churches, gorgeous parks, and the imposing Wallsend Hall. Nowadays, long after the era of the Romans, Wallsend is one of the largest towns in North Tyneside, home to a population of over 40,000 people, which grew mostly during the industrial era, as both coal mining and shipbuilding became major employers in the area, drawing in thousands of workers who settled here. For a long time, Wallsend was a much smaller settlement based around the historic Holy Cross Church in the Valley Gardens near Wallsend Hall, but as the population grew, it became apparent that more facilities were needed for its people. Here, we're walking past St Luke's Church, which was built over 2 decades from 1887 until 1906 to serve the people of Western Wallsend, many of whom worked in the shipyards just a short walk down the road, earning St Luke's the local nickname, the Shipyard Church. Shipbuilders have always been an integral part of the community here in Wallsend, to the point that they're commemorated in a number of monuments around town, the most important of which you'll find here just opposite the Shipyard Church. This is the Swan Hunter War Memorial, erected in 1925 in memory of the local men who lost their lives in the First World War, a large proportion of whom worked in Swan Hunter's shipyards down by the Tyne. Such was the sacrifice of over 1,300 Swan Hunter shipbuilders who died in the First World War, a simple monument wasn't enough, and the company financed the building of this huge memorial hall, with the war memorial set into its walls here on Frank Street. The Swan Hunter Memorial Hall today remains one of the main civic venues in central Wallsend, and along with the Shipyard Church opposite, it's one of just a few buildings that were at least in part funded by Wallsend's most famous shipbuilding merchants, and still stand as a monument to the importance of the industry in the town. As we mentioned, Swan Hunter ended its shipbuilding operations on the Tyne in 2006, after having served as a key point of development for Wallsend as a whole ever since it was founded back in 1880. Over those 126 years of operation, Swan Hunter employed thousands of Wallsend locals for the construction of hundreds of ships, including some of Britain's greatest, such as transatlantic steamships like the RMS Mauretania, which for 20 years held the record for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic Ocean, and the RMS Carpathia, which in April of 1912 came to the rescue of 705 people who were floating in the freezing waters of the mid-Atlantic after having survived the disastrous sinking of the Titanic. Now, we find ourselves beside the High Street, and on this small square is Wallsend's main shopping centre, the Forum, again named for the town's Roman roots, along with a popular local pub and a number of delightful floral displays. Among the bushes there stands this rather interesting sculpture, the Market Woman, a bronze statue that depicts a Roman woman holding a basket containing chickens on her head, likely taking them to be sold at the local marketplace. The Market Woman sculpture was placed here beside the High Street in 1966, and it was intended to show the other side of Wallsend's Roman heritage, as a place that was more than just a military fort, but a bustling civilian community too. Nearly 2,000 years later, Wallsend remains a busy town on the outskirts of Newcastle, with the large Anson Pub here serving as one of its main watering holes. The Anson is fairly new in the scope of Wallsend's history, opened in 1967 to replace the old Station Hotel, which closed the year before, and designed to complement the then new Forum shopping centre beside. The pub takes its name from the HMS Anson, another of the many famous ships built at the Swan Hunter Shipyard in Wallsend, and which served during the Second World War in the Arctic, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific Ocean, the ship most famously hosting the official surrender of Japanese forces occupying Hong Kong in 1945. Naval vessels built at Wallsend included everything from battleships to destroyers, and even the aircraft carrier HMS Albion, which served across the world's oceans for 26 years from 1947 to 1973. Now here, just beyond the Anson Pub, we're walking past the Wallsend Customer First Centre, which, as you can see from the design, was another part of the 1966 project that included the building of the Forum and the redevelopment of this central part of town. And the big white building here is today also the home of Wallsend's Library, which moved in 2014. Having now made our way across the High Street and past some of the most prominent buildings at the centre of Wallsend today, we now find ourselves on the northern half of Station Road, which will take us up towards the northern edge of town and the area known as Wallsend Green, which was historically closer to the centre of the original settlement of Wallsend, before industry drew focus down towards this area and the riverside. In fact, even today, the area around the original settlement of Wallsend looks rather like a picturesque countryside village, and a world away from the urban 20th century town centre that we've explored so far. But to get there, we'll now be making our way along Station Road, home to a long row of terraced houses, facing a number of intriguing local buildings. Here, for example, we can see the Trinity Methodist Church, one of a number of churches to be found in the modern town of Wallsend. Now, many of the housing developments to be found in Wallsend today were built in the aftermath of the Second World War, but the many pre-war buildings, like the Methodist Church, demonstrate just how big the town had grown throughout the 19th century, not only as a result of shipbuilding, but also coal mining. As with the rest of the Tyneside region, coal mining was big business in Wallsend for many decades. The town's mining industry was focused principally around Wallsend Colliery, which operated for 157 years between 1778 and 1935, and contained as many as 7 pits, most focused on an area a few streets to the east of here, which was famously rich in coal deposits. The coal seam at Wallsend was almost 6 feet thick, providing quality coal that brought great prosperity to the colliery's owners. In fact, the coal deposits here were so notorious that the term Wallsend coal was for a long time used as a byword for high-quality, profitable goods, and many other northeast coal mines would even brand their produce with the name Wallsend, to piggyback off this town's fame in the industry. Word of Wallsend's famous coal spread much further than the northeast of England, however, and in 1816, none other than Tsar Nicholas I of Russia actually made an official visit to Wallsend and its colliery, though despite encouragement from locals, the Tsar wasn't all too keen to go inside the pit itself. While shipbuilding later rose to become the town's main industry, coal mining continued in Wallsend well into the 20th century, the last colliery on the edge of town eventually closing down in 1969. Now, we've made our way off Station Road, and we're passing by the former Buddle School, built in 1876, and which later went on to become the Buddle Arts Centre. The Buddle School, built to cater to the children of the town's ballooning population in the late 19th century, also marks the entrance to North Road, and a heavily residential, pleasantly suburban area of Wallsend. Now, over the years, Wallsend has been the place that many famous names have called home, and not only those in the shipbuilding and coal mining businesses. One of the biggest celebrities from Wallsend is the Police frontman, Sting, who was born here in 1951 and grew up near the town's shipyards, which are often referenced in his music. Meanwhile, many nationally famous footballers began their careers at the notable Wallsend Boys Club, a youth club founded back in 1904 that has produced an array of players, including Premier League record goalscorer Alan Shearer, former Liverpool and Newcastle forward Peter Beardsley, and the highly decorated Manchester United midfielder Michael Carrick, who was actually born in the town. On their days off from training, many of the footballers at Wallsend Boys Club will have surely enjoyed a kickabout in some of the town's many parks, like the beautiful Richardson Dees Park that we're entering now. The park takes its name from a local solicitor named Robert Richardson Dees, who in 1897 donated 14 acres of his estate to the town to be used as a park, which opened in the year 1900 and which has retained a very similar appearance over the last 122 years. For a long time, Richardson Dees Park was simply known as Wallsend Park, and as one of the very first public grounds to open in the town, its inauguration was a huge event, said to have seen the largest attendance of any public event in the history of Wallsend. You could see the hallmarks of a prosperous, late Victorian-era Wallsend littered all over this wonderful park, from the quaint groundsmen's houses to trickling streams, lush greenery, ornate fountains, bandstands, and a gorgeous bowling green and pavilion here on the south side of the park. There are also tennis courts and plenty more open spaces to be found in this really rather expansive piece of parkland. But before this area went into use as a place for public recreation and leisure, it was an important part of Wallsend's industrial profile. Before the land formed part of Robert Richardson Dees's estate, this area in particular, south of the bowling green, was the site of one of the pits of Wallsend Colliery, known as the Sea Pit or Gas Pit, and which was opened back in 1786 as the first arm of expansion of the mine, as the quality and quantity of local coal deposits became apparent. The Sea Pit that existed here is also notorious as the place where rescue efforts were carried out during the worst mining disaster in Wallsend's history, when an explosion at a neighbouring pit in the summer of 1835 killed 102 men and boys, the youngest of which was sadly just 8 years old. The Sea Pit was closed not long after the disaster in 1854, with the land later becoming part of this park, and the old mine shaft was covered over by a large grate. Inevitably though, it became a favourite pastime of many of Wallsend's young'uns to throw stones down into the mine shaft, which was so deep that you never even hear the rocks hit the bottom. Now, having made our way out of the park and with the former site of the Sea Pit just behind the railings to our left, we're going to continue along North Road towards the idyllic heart of Old Wallsend, which as we mentioned is today known as Wallsend Green. Wallsend Green is a bit of a step back in time compared to the town as we've seen it so far. But what exactly was the story of this area after the Romans abandoned Segedunum at the turn of the 5th century? Well, this area suffered in the short term after the Romans' withdrawal, with the marauding Picts coming down from the north and the Angles and Saxons from the east and south, all of whom raided and pillaged what was left of the fort and the small civilian settlement that existed outside. This chaos remained a reality in Wallsend for a couple of centuries, with many of the town's Roman buildings destroyed in raids, although along with the fort, remains of Roman civilian buildings are still occasionally unearthed in the town, one of the most recent being an old Roman bathhouse in the former Ship-in-the-Hole pub, which was excavated in 2013. The immediate post-Roman chaos came to an end for a couple of centuries during the so-called Golden Age of Northumbria, as Christianity spread across the region and wealthy, politically significant monasteries and churches were established, making this part of the world one of the most advanced on the island of Great Britain. The Vikings' raid on the holy island of Lindisfarne in 793 AD put an end to that golden age, and Wallsend too fell victim to Viking raids as the Tyneside region was laid to waste by Danes flooding up the Tyne from the sea, and constant warring between settled tribes and invading forces left little room for development in Wallsend. Things then eventually calmed down when the Normans and William the Conqueror established their authority over England, and so came the earliest origins of Wallsend as we know it today. As we walk alongside the lush village green that makes up the heart of Wallsend's most beautiful and leafy quarter, in the year 1150, just a short distance away, Norman settlers built a small stone church dedicated to the Holy Cross. This was the Holy Cross Church that served the people of Wallsend for centuries, until its modern 19th century churches were built, and the ruins of the old medieval church can still be found within the town's sprawling valley gardens. But why did the settlement emerge here, and not down by the River Tyne and the old fort? Well, the church was built beside a small stream known as Wallsend Burn, which flows through a pronounced valley that we'll see in a couple of moments. The village green in the centre of what came to be Wallsend then was positioned high up above both the valley and the River Tyne, giving it an advantageous location in the face of any attacks by raiders. For the best part of 800 years, Wallsend remained a small and pleasant village located around the green and the valley, with agriculture and a small glassmaking industry serving as its main source of income. But it wasn't until the arrival of coal mining that the settlement really began to expand into the size that we know today. However, even before coal mining began bringing in extra wealth to Wallsend, this part of the village was home to an important place of residence in the form of Wallsend Hall. Now, a hall has existed here just beyond these trees since as long ago as the 16th century, belonging to the Hindmarsh family, the village's chief family at the time. After the last of the Hindmarshes died in the early 18th century, their hall was sold into the hands of the wealthy Muncasters of Newcastle, and then to William Clark, the first mayor of Wallsend, who lived here until 1812. In 1812, the original Wallsend Hall was demolished, and the impressive building that we see today was built in its place, complete with exquisite private grounds that we've been walking through, and ornate palatial rooms inside. In 1856, Robert Richardson Dees bought the hall and lived here for over 50 years, leaving part of the grounds to be used as the Richardson Dees Park that we visited earlier. Then, in 1914, Wallsend Hall was bought by none other than George Burton Hunter, the founder of the Swan Hunter shipbuilders that really brought Wallsend to prominence in the industrial era. Such was Hunter's devotion to the town and its people, many of whom worked for him on the shipyards, that he donated the historic Wallsend Hall and its grounds to the town to be used by the public, and today the residence remains open, often used for weddings and other events, while its spacious gardens make up yet another part of the town's seemingly endless acres of parkland. Having passed by the hall itself, we're now looking over its former grounds that incorporate the large valley through which Wallsend Burn flows, and beside which the village emerged in the early medieval era. Sadly, however, this now brings us to the end of our walk around the enthralling town of Wallsend. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're now looking forward to visiting Wallsend for yourself sometime soon.